Overnight, 500 Palestinians with dual citizenships or other nationalities have left through Egypt's Rafah crossing. This includes 23 of the 88 Australian citizens, residents or relatives who've been living in or visiting Gaza. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has made clear he wants these 88 people to come to Australia. But there are grave concerns that he will bring them straight into our country without proper security checks. What are their political affiliations? Do they share our Australian values and ideals? Or are they bringing right to our shores a deep hatred for Jews that they may act upon? You have to ask, if Gaza is hell on earth, like everyone claims, if it's a prison, why have these people chosen to live or visit there? Albanese, a lifelong pro-Palestinian activist, hasn't once mentioned security concerns about bringing people who may have been on the front line right into Australia. He hasn't once mentioned a word about what the government will be doing to make sure they haven't been involved in the barbaric terror attacks on Israel. Opposition leader Peter Dutton is very concerned about this security risk, as he told Ray Hadley last week.
Do you have any grave concerns about the possibility or safety risk of people being repatriated from Gaza, Palestinians, who may be sympathetic to Hamas and bringing them here, and their possible associations? I mean, it appears to me that many people who may have been here and born here have an undying allegiance to that part of the world that they can't separate from their Australian citizenship. And I hate to think that all of a sudden at some time down the track we start to repatriate people from that part of the world because of the damage that's going to be caused, that they come here and bring with them ill will.
So the government would need to be very wary about bringing people out of a very difficult war-torn environment at the moment. Ultimately, the Prime Minister's got to act in our country's best interests, and I don't believe it's in our country's best interests to be increasing that intake at the moment without certainty around who individuals are and the fact that they're going to, be perfect Australian citizens or as best as we can hope for. So I think that the circumstances and the conditions at the moment are precarious, and I'd be surprised if the government's considering that, to answer your question.
So you heard there Peter Dutton say he'd be surprised if the government was considering this. Well, the government is considering this. It's doing it. We asked Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill if security checks are being done or have been done on these people leaving Gaza before they land in Australia. Her office told us just this evening, we are closely vetting the status of Australians and family members exiting Gaza. Australia also has strong laws aimed at discouraging the movement of Australians who pose security concerns, including passport cancellations. No details, though, on whether they will be put in a camp, a refugee camp, a processing detention facility while these security checks are underway. No detail about how long this will take. This is a gravely serious issue. ASIO is already concerned about the risk to the Jewish community, and we've seen people feel comfortable enough to openly say that Jews should be gassed and killed in Australia, and police didn't lift a finger at the time. And now Albanese wants to bring people, some of whom could be coming straight from the front line into the country. We have to pray that our security agencies will muscle up to him and say that these checks need to be done to ensure none of them have been involved with Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or any other terror group. There were rigorous security checks before anyone was brought into the country during the war on ISIS in Syria and Iraq. As you know, the relatives of ISIS fighters, the so-called ISIS brides, spent years in detention camps while security agencies assessed their risk. So we need to know that the same will be done now. Hamas barbarians didn't care if their targets were babies, the elderly, pregnant women, and we have to ensure this terrorism never comes into Australia. We need to protect our children in Jewish schools. Anti-Semitism is already at unprecedented levels. Now, the calls today for a ceasefire from Israel are growing. And even Joe Biden today seemed to say that Israel should take a pause in its fighting. They were bizarre comments from the US president, who until now has been extremely strong and supportive of Israel. It's unclear if he was confused or muddled in that moment, or if he knew what he was saying. But what is clear is that anti-Semitism has reached fever pitch in the United States, just like it has here in Australia. Look at these images of Jewish students, trying to escape a Harvard anti-Israel protest. Harvard University. Former Harvard President Larry Summers has already blasted the Ivy League school and its leadership, saying we're in a time of moral crisis. I mean, these are terrifying pictures to be looking at. And this all comes after Jewish students in New York had to lock themselves in a library to escape an angry mob of pro-Palestinian protesters. And just today in Bondi Beach, there was a beautiful tribute to those being held hostage by Hamas, and men started ripping the posters of the Jews down. You can see in the clip I'm about to show you a pregnant woman arguing with them not to take down the posters. She says, "This is my family." Have a look.
The hostages aren't here, mate. They're not here. So why are we bringing them on? They're not your family.
What are you here for?
Because we don't need to bring this violence here. Why?
Yeah, but you are. You are. You're bringing your posters and your flags and everything.
You can see the men are holding scrunched up pictures of the hostages. Bondi Beach just today. With scenes like this all over the world, the FBI Director Christopher Wray came out and warned that the risk of terror is now heightened. He said the threat level has been raised. He made these comments at the Senate Committee on Homeland Security this week.
The reality is that the terrorism threat has been elevated throughout 2023, but the ongoing war in the Middle East has raised the threat of an attack against Americans in the United States to a whole nother level.
He said he couldn't discount the possibility that Hamas or another foreign terror organisation wouldn't exploit the current conflict to conduct attacks on US soil. And yet, Kamala Harris posted this on her social media today. She wrote, "Taking on hate is a national priority. Today, the President of the United States and I are announcing the country's first national strategy to counter, wait for it, not anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. This action is the latest step forward in our work to combat a surge of hate in America."
And so today, I am proud to announce the Biden-Harris administration will develop our nation's first national strategy to counter Islamophobia.
No one is saying Islamophobia isn't a problem and shouldn't be tackled. Of course, it's important. But right now, it's undeniable that the biggest problem globally we're witnessing is anti-Semitism. That's why the FBI Director, Christopher Wray, publicly issued his warning. But not according to the hapless Kamala Harris. It reminds me of when the White House Press Secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, was asked also about anti-Semitism and turned it into a question about Islamophobia.
Level of concern right now about the potential rise of anti-Semitism in light of everything that's going on in Israel?
So a couple of things. We have not seen any credible threats. I know there's been always questions about credible threats, and so just want to make sure that that's out there. But look, Muslim and those perceived to be Muslim have endured a disproportionate number of hate-fueled attacks.
Now, interestingly, Anthony Albanese took this same approach today. He turned a question about anti-Semitism into an answer about Islamophobia. Have a look.
We are concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism, which has been on the rise, and we provided money for security in Jewish schools and Jewish institutions, synagogues, but we've also provided money for the Islamic community and the Palestinian community. There are women very regularly who get abused, who get vilified because they're wearing a hijab in this country as well. And these forms of hatred are completely unacceptable.
You get the sense that our leaders really aren't doing enough to protect the Jewish community, that they aren't taking this terrifying, unprecedented rise in hatred towards Jews seriously enough. By contrast, Hillary Clinton has been very strong in her support of Israel, saying that a ceasefire would only strengthen Hamas.
People who are calling for a ceasefire now do not understand Hamas. That is not possible. It would be such a gift to Hamas because they would spend whatever time there was a ceasefire in effect rebuilding their armaments, creating stronger positions to be able to fend off an eventual assault by the Israelis.
She's right, of course, as we've been speaking about this week. You wouldn't have a ceasefire with the Nazis or with ISIS, so why would you with Hamas, who are every bit as evil? The way Hamas slaughtered innocent babies and young people clearly shows it shouldn't be given the opportunity to regroup. A senior Hamas official, Ghazi Hamad, made clear that their aim is the total annihilation of Israel in an interview with a television station in Lebanon just a few days ago.
دولة لا مقام لها على أرضنا، إحنا الدولة لابد أن نزيلها، لأنه بالفعل هي تعتبر كارثة أمنية وعسكرية وسياسية للأمة العربية والإسلامية، يجب أن تنتهي. لذلك احنا لا نخجل من نقول ذلك بكل قوه انه إسرائيل لازم نأدبها وحنأدبها مره ثانيه وثالثه، ومش هذا حتكون طوفان الاقصى اول مره، لا حتكون ثانيه وثالثه ورابعه، لانه احنا لدينا اصرار ولدينا قرار ولدينا امكانيات ان نقاتل نعم. ونحارب، لكن كما قلت لك بدنا ندفع ثمن. نعم احنا مستعدين، معلش بدي اقول لك بشكل واضح، احنا اسمنا شعب الشهداء وبنفخر ان نقدم شهداء، احنا لا نريد ان نمس لا بالمدنيين ولا ان نلحق الاذى بهم، لكن اوقات لانه في تعقيدات في الميدان صارت في منطقة موجودة، وكان هناك في احتفال وكان في سكان وفي منطقة واسعة ليست سهلة على امتداد تقريبا 40 كيلومتر. يجب أن ننتهي.
أن ينتهي وين؟ بقطاع غزة؟
ينتهي إلى لا بتكلم عنه كل الأراضي الفلسطينية.
كل الأراضي الفلسطينية يعني زوال طبعاً. إسرائيل؟
طبعا. وجود إسرائيل غير منطقي. وجود إسرائيل هو اللي بخلق كل هذه الآلام والعذابات والدموع والدماء، هي إسرائيل مش احنا ضحيه الاحتلال، نقطه واخر السطر. لذلك ما حدا يلومنا، احنا شو اللي بنعمله في 7 اكتوبر، في 10 اكتوبر، في مليون اكتوبر، احنا اللي بنعمل مبرر. It is justified، مبرره.
So that Hamas leader making clear he wants the annihilation of all of Israel and that Hamas would repeat again and again the atrocities, the slaughter of October 7. But Albanese still wants a ceasefire, a point he made once again today.
Well, we said a week ago that there was a need for a pause for humanitarian concerns. And that remains our position.
You cannot have a ceasefire with Hamas. You can't have peace with Hamas. They don't want peace. They want to continue to commit terror attacks against Jews every single day until Israel is destroyed, as that Hamas leader, Ghazi Hamad, made abundantly clear. How can you have a ceasefire with a terror group? You can't. UK's Labour leader, Keir Starmer, by the way, also agrees that there can't be a ceasefire with Hamas. He says that this would only embolden them.
Because a ceasefire always freezes any conflict in the state where it currently lies. And as we speak, that would leave Hamas with the infrastructure and the capability to carry out the sort of attack we saw on October the 7th.
So, Hillary Clinton and British Labour are both at odds with Albanese and Penny Wong. Now, we've seen that proportionality has been quite a big theme in this war, but a Victorian Labour politician, Philip Dalidakis, has exposed the hypocrisy of Greens and other politicians who didn't seem to care about the number of Syrian lives lost in the battle against ISIS or the number of those killed in Afghanistan or civilians in Yemen, but suddenly they're obsessed with casualties in Israel's war on terror.
If you look at Adam Bandt, he's spoken twice about Yemen since he's been in Parliament. And of course, the conflict in Yemen started in 2014, and he's been a Member of Parliament since 2010. But he's spoken about Israel 14 times. Senator Steele John who is the spokesperson for Foreign Affairs, has spoken about Israel 6 times in Parliament. He's spoken about Yemen 0 times. And of course, when it comes to one of our own senators here in Victoria, the outgoing retiring Senator Janet Rice, she's spoken about Israel 12 times, but she's spoken about 500,000 deaths in Yemen exactly 0 times. What you can see is a very clear bias, almost anti-Semitism from the Greens party.
It doesn't seem to me that Labor and the Greens care as much about civilian casualties in any other region of the world, but now they demand that terrorists be defeated without a single loss of life, because it's Israel. And perhaps they think that Israel's right to exist as a homeland of the Jewish people isn't a worthy cause for war. Netanyahu wrote in the Wall Street Journal this week that just as the United States wouldn't have agreed to a ceasefire after the bombing of Pearl Harbor or after 9/11, he won't agree to one after October 7. He said it would be a surrender to terror. He wrote, as long as the international community blames Israel for Hamas's use of Palestinian human shields, Hamas will continue to employ this tool of terror. He wrote, Hamas will continue to use the basements in Gaza's hospitals as the command posts of its vast terror tunnel network. It will continue to use mosques as fortified military outposts and weapons depots. He said it will continue to steal depots. He said it will continue depots. It will continue to steal fuel and humanitarian assistance from United Nations facilities. He wrote, while Israel is doing everything to get Palestinian civilians out of harm's way, Hamas is doing everything to keep Palestinian civilians in harm's way. Now, we saw an interview last night on the ABC where Israel's former Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, said that many of those that we think or that Hamas calls innocent civilians actually aren't innocent at all. He says that they're terrorists. And in fact, contrary to reports, he said that there were no civilians killed during Israel's strike at the Hamas base underneath the Jabalian refugee camp in northern Gaza. Have a look.
As I just mentioned, the Israeli army last night struck the Jabalia refugee camp, claiming to kill a senior Hamas commander involved in the attacks on Israel. But the strike also killed dozens of civilians. Does Israel make a calculation as to how many innocents it's prepared to kill to take out one Hamas commander?
First of all, I'm not certain that so many innocent civilians were killed yesterday. It was headquarters of Hamas, and everyone present there was part of Hamas and the fighting group of Hamas. They were killed, but they were not innocent civilians to start with.
But apparently Albanese knows more than Ehud Olmert, because today Albanese said that the images of that terrorist camp being bombed were cause for enormous concern.
Israel needs to recognise that in the way that it conducts itself, because the images that have been seen of the refugee camp, quite rightly, will cause enormous concern around the world.
Do you believe Israel has already overstepped the mark?
I think that every effort has to be made to ensure that innocent civilians are protected to every extent possible. The civilian toll is quite rightly causing enormous concern around the world. People are quite rightly traumatised. I met with people yesterday afternoon who have lost family members in Gaza. They are quite right to be traumatised and want their government to speak up for them, just as their government has spoken up for the loss of Israeli life.
That's our Prime Minister. Albanese there lecturing Israel again, offering it unsolicited military advice. He's also taking Hamas's word that civilians were killed, whereas Israel says that it was a targeted strike on the Hamas headquarters and it's unaware if any civilians were injured. As Olmert said, there weren't. Now, Olmert also said there's a trap here where Hamas, and I'd then add politicians like Albanese and Penny Wong and media like the ABC, describe people as innocent civilians when many of them are killers. When the host Sarah Ferguson put to Olmert last night that there were a high number of civilian casualties, he completely rejected the claim. Look at this quite stunning interaction where Olmert questions that narrative that there's a high number of civilian casualties. He says it's false.
It's been obvious that there have been very high civilian casualties in Gaza. Let me ask you a question about your own time as Prime Minister. Did you make calculations like this when you were...
Miss Ferguson,
yes.
Miss Ferguson, if I may say, it's not, nothing is obvious. You don't know, obviously, in Sydney, or anyone even here knows the exact and accurate number of casualties among civilians. They make an announcement. Sometimes they know the number of people killed even before they uncover the ruins behind them. So, we have to be very careful. I believe that there are innocent casualties, and I regret every one of them. But let's not be a little bit to get away with the inflated and unrealistic numbers.
Remember, Olmert is no friend of Netanyahu. But Albanese seems to be swallowing the Hamas line about how many civilians have died, figures that both the United States administration and Israel say are exaggerated, inflated, or completely wrong.